Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contracts. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Osita Nwoevu, a contributing editor at The New Republic, a columnist at The Guardian, and a Democratic Institutions Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. He's the author of The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding, which we'll be discussing today. Osita Nwoevu, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I think if you asked most people to define democracy, they'd say something like rule of the people. And if you push them a little further and said, well, how does that happen? They'd maybe say free, fair, and frequent elections. Does that leave anything out? I mean, what do you think about that kind of definition?
Well, I think that you're right that that's the definition that would come to mind for most people quite easily. You go to the polls every couple of years, you vote for a guy, the guy goes into office, they hopefully do the things that you want. And the basic conceptual tangle there, one of the first ones you run into when you try to think about this seriously is, well, we told ourselves in the Western tradition that democracy began with a quite different system in Athens. So this is a system in which people directly went to the assembly as citizens, participated in lawmaking. The things that they passed there were often implemented by people who were selected randomly by law. And so this is a system in which people directly participate in governance in ways that we would find very, very strange today, probably very, very difficult to implement in many respects. But we told ourselves that these are both democracies. And so the conceptual question you have to ask is, well, what is the thing that these two systems have in common? What is it that both of them are trying to do and try to accomplish? I think the best you can come up with is the idea that democracy, in some sense, is the idea that the governed should govern. Governance is not given over to some alien authority, some king, some class of elites. The people who are themselves subject to government are the ones doing the governing. That looked one way in Athens with very direct precipitation. In our sense today, we hope and believe that the representatives we elect are there to represent our interests and do the things that we'd like them to do. And so the central core concept is the governed governing, or as Lincoln puts it, government of, by, and for the people. I think that encapsulates both systems, and you can get into sort of wonky kind of nerdy thought experiments to kind of test people's intuitions here. One of the things I like tossing out to people is, look, let's say we had an election. It was free, it was fair, people's votes counted equally. But at the end of the election, everybody's votes went into a hat, and the winner was selected randomly. That's a free and fair election. People counted equally, So there's something about that kind of violates our basic intuitions there. So there's something more to it than that. And so I also go into, in the first part of the book, beyond the idea of the governing, how do we actually know that that's happening? What are the characteristics of a system in which that's true? And the things that come up with are, equality. So people's votes should count equally. People should be in equal standing when they come to a collective choice. Responsiveness. This is the thing I think the random selection example kind of violates. We want something to happen kind of conclusively as a result of people coming together. It's not thrown into random chance. Democracy is not a suggestion box. Things happen, as a consequence of you coming together politically. And the last thing, I think the most contentious and complicated thing, is majority rule. So all the principles that you might consider in how to make a collective choice, from some version of unanimity all the way down through some version of minority rule, majority rule is the one that's consistent with the principle of equality, which we just talked about. So if two people want one thing, three people want some other thing, it's very hard for the two to get their way over the three unless there's some kind of fundamental inequality involved. This gets very, very complicated. You've read the book, but I think that the intuition there is there's something important too about at least aiming for some form of majority rule. So that's a basic sketch, basic outline of what democracy is and what it means. I think I've saved your listeners a lot of time reading a lot of very dusty, very dry political theory, political philosophy books, but that's the best I could do.
What's the case for democracy? By that I mean, there's that quote by Churchill that I'm sure you're familiar with, where he says it's the worst form of government except for all those other forms of government that have been tried from time to time. And I think that really captures something, because it's almost impossible to get a perfect form of government. But in your view, democracy is the best, or at least the least bad system, I guess, making it Churchillian. Yeah. Why is that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing about that quote is that it's kind of saying both things at the same time. Worst except for all the others is the best. And so if this is the best way we can go about making choices as a society, I think we should be kind of enthusiastic about that. I think it's a matter of perspective, a kind of glass half full, glass half empty kind of thing. But I do go through some basic practical advantages I think democracies have over systems of rule by the few in some sense, which I think is the only other alternative, whether that's a king or a class of elites or philosopher kings, whatever. There are certain things I think rule by the many has to offer. One is agency. If you believe that governance should be conducted in the interest of those who are governed, well, I think it's an important advantage that the people who are governed have the capacity to decide what their own problems are and figure out how to fix them. They're not waiting for some king to decide that they have this or that problem, or some alien class of elites. They themselves can do the work of saying something needs to be done. Let's figure out how to do it. The second thing I'd say is democracies are dynamic. They're very, very good intrinsically at kind of generating change. There are points of decision and evaluation. You can change one guy out for another, change one policy out for another, in ways that are built into the structure of the whole system. You might hope that a king would act dynamically, or some class of elites and experts might act dynamically, but democracy has that inbuilt as a kind of feature of the system, which I think is a good thing. And the last thing I'd say is procedure. When we go about trying to make change, democracy offers us kind of explicit ways of doing so. You don't have to have a revolution every time you want something else to change. You want to change the guy who's at the top of the system. Democracy has these kind of inbuilt procedures that allow us to process change relative to other systems. I think these are the core practical benefits that I focus on. One other thing I talk about in the book as well is, a lot of people think that there's something to the concept of collective intelligence, that when many, many people come together to make a choice or make a decision, they can draw upon diversity of perspectives, they can draw upon different sources of information, and that leads potentially to better decision-making than if you left a decision to one person or a very small group of people. Again, I think this gets very, very complicated. I think I'm kind of mixed in my opinion about all this, but I think there could be something to that general. So those are the kind of practical reasons. But I think, too, that for me personally, I think for a lot of people as well, intuitively, there's also something, frankly, kind of spiritual, even metaphysical about the way we think about democracy. The idea that we're entitled to a basic measure of say over the conditions that shape our lives. We're not just thrown into the world without any ability to affect things or to inherit certain structures of power and certain hierarchies. We have some ability to change society. Each and every one of us is entitled to that. That's not a practical argument per se, but I think it's a deep intuition and a kind of first principle for me personally, and I think that's true of many people. Whether they can articulate that or not, I don't know. But I think that's one of the things that's also going on in how deeply I think we revere democracy.
I certainly believe all that. But I wonder, when we move from folks like you and folks like me who really think about politics a lot, are very politically involved, how much the average Americans care about democracy. It seems like certainly when Democrats have run on that message, it's sort of fallen flat. And I wonder if most Americans care much more about outcomes, and that, hey, if an authoritarian system gives them economic prosperity, safety, and maybe a certain amount of personal liberty, that's okay. What do you think about that?
No, I think there's something to that. I mean, certainly if you go to polls and you ask Americans, do you value democracy? Do you believe in democracy? Across the board, people say yes. Revealed preference, one of my favorite phrases, suggests otherwise, especially in this last election, I would argue. People do care, I think, very, very deeply about their own material lives and their own material well-being and their immediate conditions. And I think, democracy, as we kind of understand today, and we kind of take for granted today, across the world, this is not a universal principle by any stretch of the imagination. We look to China. There's all this hope, at the turn of this century that, with growing economic prosperity, you'd see these growing demands for democratic change take place in that country. I haven't really seen that. People seem pretty pretty okay. And so for those of us who really do believe in democracy, again, from a kind of first principles perspective, we do think this is the best system of government. You have to kind of make the argument to people. You have to say, look, there's something about this system that could potentially benefit you. It's not just an abstraction. It's not just this kind of ideals you were told to value by your civics teacher. There is something they can do to deliver it for you in ways that other forms of government and other systems can't. So I think you're right to say that, notionally people have very positive feelings about the word democracy, the general concept. When it comes to make a choice, and I think this matters for those of us who are troubled by the rise of authoritarian feelings, they will not always choose democracy. And those of us who want to defend and even expand democracy, as I do, have the burden of explaining to them, this isn't just a notional commitment you should have. This is a deep commitment you should have for all kinds of reasons.
There's this thing called the folk theory of democracy. And the basic idea is regular folks have these policy preferences and they elect people, representatives who are supposed to act on those, give them what they want. And if they don't, they vote them out of office. And it seems like a nice idea in theory, but a lot of my fellow political scientists who study this say, no, it doesn't really work that way, mostly because voters are not very well informed. And so it's kind of like in the programming world, what garbage in, garbage out sort of thing, not to be too blunt about it. But the problem is with uneducated, uninformed voters. And what's your take? I know you've engaged with this research. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I have a very kind of dense section of the book where I go into books like Democracy for Realists by Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels, which got a lot of attention, I think, about 10 years ago. A book called Against Democracy by Jason Brennan, where they marshal a lot of, I think, important research to wrestle with about, how misinformed voters can be, how they're not really plugged in a lot of the time. Frankly, my favorite book in this genre was a book that was written more than 100 years ago, Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, where he talked about all of the different distractions that face people as they try to make political choices. So even when people are informed, even when they're really, really smart, the pace of life, all the things you have to compete with to make political decisions, all the different demands on your attention, those in and of themselves place real barriers on our ability to make good decisions. I certainly experienced this as somebody who covers politics professionally. There's a lot to keep track of. And so the average voter is facing a lot. And I think that's important to wrestle with. But I do come away with less pessimism about the public reading these books and reading some other things than I think that they want people to have. First of all, I do think that voters have policy preferences. If you were to put out a presidential platform saying that we should raise taxes on the middle class by 30, 40%, you would very quickly discover that voters had preferences on that question, or to ban cars or something. So voters do, in a certain respect, at least have a kind of sensitivity to things that directly affect them. And I think that should tell us something. That should tell us that they're capable of assessing their own personal situation in a way that is useful, ways they're useful for politics. And to the extent that, voters might rely upon different cues or different leaders to sort of give them a sense of what they should think, I think that Aiken and Bartels want people to feel wrong about that. Ideally, maybe people would just sort of sit at their dining tables and look at, policy papers and decide for themselves what to do. I actually don't think there's that much that's wrong with saying, hey, I have a certain set of values as a conservative or a liberal. There's a party out there that represents these values, generally speaking. I might not know everything that there is to know about tariffs or environmental policy or tax policy, but I know that there's a party that represents what I generally believe about society. And maybe that's one reason that I should vote for that party rather than another party. I don't think that's unreasonable. I think that parties in this way can actually make democracy more accessible. I just think that there are all kinds of ways in which the doubts about the public's capacities kind of don't jibe well with the history of democracy in this country, too, as I describe it in the book. So we had periods in this country where we actually absorbed many, many voters, kind of in rapid fashion, who would have been less informed and less capable and less knowledgeable about politics than people who had already been participating in government. And that was when we admitted African Americans to vote, and we admitted women to vote. These are people who would not have known as much about politics as people who had been able to for years and years and years. And so if you believe that there's something we should be fatalistic about public capacities and public ignorance, we should ask ourselves, did the country become weaker in any way when we absorbed these less informed constituencies? Did we become less strong? Did things kind of spiral out into chaos? And they didn't. And we should ask ourselves why that is. That suggests to me that there's more capacity to absorb the public, even if they're not experts, then I think the skeptics would have us assume. So this is like a dense section of the book. There's a lot of things going on.
I love it. So, I geek out on that stuff. So,
Sorry, go ahead.
I say, no, I geek out on that stuff. So really, and most of our audience loves that stuff too. So
one other thing I would say too is this. I mean, these are books where you're hearing arguments aimed at increasing our skepticism about democracy in general. They're based upon particular facts about the American electorate. But obviously, democracy exists elsewhere. You have other forms of democratic government, and you have different capacities, different knowledge bases amongst different electorates. And we could be doing more to bring our own electorate up to snuff. I mean, we have heavy investments in Europe in things like public media, nonpartisan, nonprofit media infrastructure that informs people without those kinds of incentives. We, on the other hand, in this country are attacking the little public media that we have. I think about 2% of Americans tune into public television. Who knows what that percent's going to be a year from now that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has been attacked. That's one very basic thing we could try. We could invest more in civic education. So again, I just don't see as much reason for fatalism about this kind of stuff. Even to the extent we might dream of rule by experts. Experts, fun fact, disagree a lot about all kinds of things. Very, very smart people come to very, very different policy conclusions. Experts can get things wrong. So yeah, I just don't put a whole lot of stock in the idea that because the public has these limitations, we should fundamentally doubt the wisdom of democracy or the integrity of democracy. I think that democracy does better than we, or the critics trying to give it credit for. And hopefully people come away from the book a little less skeptical.
I think one response to that might be that, okay, in the past, you're right that that it hasn't worked out that poorly, but that's paradoxically, I guess, because the system was less democratic. Like until the 1970s, really, the presidential nominees were essentially chosen by party elites. I mean, were some so-called beauty contest primaries and that kind of thing. And under that old system, Donald Trump never would have been the Republican Party's nominee, for example. And the thinking is that, and this is a good thing because it actually puts guardrails on democracy so that demagogues can't sort of sweep into power and use the incredibly advanced techniques of manipulation that we have today as opposed to 40, 50 years ago. And so this would be an argument actually for less democracy in the sense. What do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think that the record of primary first presidential politics since the late 1960s, since the early 1970s, it's actually been pretty solid with Donald Trump as this kind of aberration who is shocking to us because he departs so significantly from the kind of nominees we've had over the last 50 years or so. Previous nominees in the Republican Party were people like Mitt Romney and George W. Bush and Bob Dole and so on. Trump comes on this long train of pretty kind of middle-of-the-road conservative politicians. I think that the track record suggests that, the primary system isn't kind of the devil that people make it out to be. We have certain particular conditions that have led to his rise here, but I don't think that's an intrinsic thing. I don't think that we have to look at primaries as institutions that will inevitably produce radical and extremist candidates. I don't think the record justifies that so far, anyway.
Now, you talk about in the book your vision of modern democracy, and you sort of ground that in these four big principles: liberalism, democratic republicanism, agonism, and materialism. And I was hoping we could talk for an hour just on that, but I was hoping to kind of briefly sort of explain what those principles are and why they're important.
Yeah, so these are principles that I think augment democracy. I think that democracy, as much as I care about it, as deeply as I'm invested I am in it, it's not all-encompassing of all the things we'd want from government. There are certain principles that I think matter too. Liberalism, individual rights. So, this classic problem of if you have majority, the votes to disenfranchise some minority, by majority rule, what are the resources you have to kind of prevent that from happening or resist that? Concept of individual rights, I think, is very, very important in this respect. I talk in the book about how, I don't think there's as much tension between liberalism and democracy as people are given to assume, but I do think that liberalism is a system of ideas where you take the dignity, the rights, the integrity of individual identity seriously. Is an important thing to have augment the political system. And I think most of your listeners probably take that for granted. The other thing that's a little bit more niche is republicanism. And so my writing about this has been influenced significantly by theorists like Philip Pettit, wrote this book called Republicanism, I believe. And the basic theory there is that while liberalism protects kind of the freedom of non-interference, you cannot, as a government or some other entity, abuse me because I have these basic rights, republicanism takes seriously, too, the idea of freedom as non-domination. So even when people are not actively abusing us, even if people are not actively acting against us, having the power to abuse us potentially is also something that we should resist. So the real evil of slavery, for instance, conceptually, is not just the moment at which the overseer is whipping you or beating you or whatever. It's living under the conditions where that could happen to you in the first place. And so people take that principle of non-domination, they apply it to government, and they say, look, we need to have institutions that prevent any one faction within society from dominating all the others in this way. We need checks and balances in government. Maybe we need a written constitution. We certainly need a set of rules and regulations to make governance stable. We need the rule of law. I think all of these principles, too, are important to have as features of government. I later in the book, I get into different versions of republicanism and the ones that I think are most compelling for those of us who believe in democracy. But republicanism in general, I think, is a very, very worthwhile set of principles to adopt and espouse. Agonism. So this is reductively the principle that conflict can be okay. I think we often talk about democracy as though it's a system where ideally, through talking it out with other people and having, reasoned, rational debates, we all kind of veer towards a consensus in society. And I think that's often how not how society works. I think that talking things out with people is often something that actually sharpens difference and disagreements. And we have to be able to process that. We can't always assume that the goal here is to get to some kind of broad unifying consensus. We have to be able to understand democracy as a system that processes conflict well, and that takes a people's divisions matter, that people shouldn't necessarily feel ashamed or wrong about disagreeing with somebody sharply. I think this is a very controversial idea in this particular political environment, but it's something that I think matters a lot to any really grounded understanding of democracy, particularly in a society as large and diverse as the United States. And the last principle I talk about is materialism. So the idea basically that the economy matters. It's very, very difficult for you to cleave off the political world from the wider material conditions that shape society. The ancients understood this well, that inequality would be a way for elites to influence the political system. I think that we're seeing many, many examples of that in our politics today. And I think, too, that being materially deprived also prevents us from being fully empowered political participants as well. If you are worried about how you're going to pay your rent in the next month or worried how you're going to pay your bills, that's less mental attention you're able to give to politics. It's less ability you're going to have to participate in politics as a democratic citizen. And so, that way and many other ways to talk about across the course of the book, I think that material conditions matter and shape politics profoundly.
So when you look at the current U.S. system and you compare it to those four principles, where do you see as falling short the most?
Oh, falling short the most. I mean, I think that we have a political system that was, I think, designed to force a particular kind of consensus, a political system that was designed to thwart, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, majoritarianism. Political scientists, talk about all the veto points we have in the system. I think that these are things that cut against the principle of agonism, that if one party kind of wins out, as long as they're respecting the rights of others, as long as they're not acting illegally, as long as they're not, veering towards authoritarianism, it's okay to win, and it's okay to implement the policies that people elected you to implement. We have instead of that a political system that I think forces or tries to force a kind of consensus that I think is anti-democratic in the way that it's constructed. So that's one place we're falling short. And then, as somebody who is, surprise, on the left, I think that we fall short on the materialism front quite profoundly. I labored throughout, thinking through this book on the idea that, it was going to be hard to convince people to understand the need for profound economic change as part of this democratic agenda. I think, I thought, how am I going to make that intuitive to people that the economy and the health of our democracy are intrinsically connected in ways beyond, campaign finance reform and all these things. I could not have constructed a better caricature for my purposes than the specter of the wealthiest human being on earth, because he donated $200 and something million to Brown's own campaign last year. being gifted with a position in the executive branch where he got to rework the branch to his liking. If that is not an indication of how important economic equality can be and how far we are from a system that is insulated from the impact of economic equality, I don't know what would convince you. I think that was a very profound example of a deeper truth that I try to get at in the book.
You mentioned the framers, and they come up a fair amount in the book. At one point, you call them aristocratic Republicans, say they were concerned with excess democracy, especially after the Shays Rebellion and all the difficulties around that time. And I'm wondering if you think that, given that context, that was a reasonable concern and a reasonable response, or was it, as some on the kind of progressive left might say, it's happened from the beginning of time. The elite white males kind of circle the wagons, protect their own interests, and basically keep everyone else out. Maybe it's not as binary as that, but I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think you know the answer to that. Bring up the question. I mean, look, one of the provocations I make in the book is this. When you point out certain features of the political system, our political system, that are anti-democratic from the left, the response you get from conservatives is, well, look, we're a republic, not a democracy. We're not founded as a democracy. You're founded as a kind of republic. Liberals, I think, are aghast at this kind of response. One of the provocations I make in the book is to say conservatives are essentially correct about this. I agree. I agree with National Review. I agree with, the Federalist. I agree that is what actually happened. But the question there is this basic is-ought problem. The fact that we are a kind of republic, that we were founded as a kind of republic, is not itself a justification for not moving towards a democratic system if you believe in democracy, right? And so the historical part of the book, I think, is very, very important, that I try to lay out the conditions under which the Constitution was drafted, the immediate economic situation that preceded the convention, which I don't think most Americans know about. As I've pointed out to many people as I've done these talks for this book, the American Revolution was not fought with quill pens and parchment. It was a real war. It was a war that killed tens of thousands of people. It led to a complete economic crisis, the worst depression we faced in this country until the Great Depression. And in response to that, you basically have two levels of government that are dealing with the situation in the post-revolution aftermath. You have the federal government under the Articles of Confederation, which, as you do learn, I think for the most part in high school, really was a terrible system. You needed supermajorities to do anything of consequence. You couldn't amend it by anything but unanimous agreements. You could ask the states nicely for money. The states would say no. You could have really real power to compel them to do anything. Just a terrible national government. But below that, you have actually quite active and quite powerful state governments that poor people in the country immediately start appealing to for relief. In the midst of this economic crisis, they go to their state legislatures and say, look, if we could pay our debts in taxes, we can pay our debts and taxes in kind with goods, we can pay them in installments, or if you could print paper money, this would ease our economic burden significantly. They significantly petitioned the state legislatures to do this across most of the country. One of the glaring exceptions, of course, is Massachusetts, where you have this backcountry uprising. Daniel Shays is only one of the people involved, but it gets named after him, and it's eventually put down, but that uprising, there were others around the country, really, really spooks the founders. We have their letters to each other. We have what they said at the convention. And they believe that this is a kind of attack on private property. This is an attack on the creditworthiness of the country and the stability of contracts. And they come to believe that government under the Articles, for that reason, had been too accessible to democratic input. You had this impotent kind of federal government. Below it, you have this actually very kind democratic state governments that were doing all of these things the founders thought were terrible. And so they come to the convention in 1787 with a mandate to amend the Articles of Confederation. But they eventually decide very, very quickly, actually, that they're going to come up with a whole new document, a document that would create a sovereign federal government capable of acting directly upon the American people, asking them directly for things that would be less subject to, less influenced by democratic control than the whole governing situation under the Articles. And, there's a very, very good book by Michael Klarman called The Framers' Coup that delves into this even more deeply. People like Woody Holton have also written about this as well, but it's secret, really. It's not something that is hidden, is conspiratorial. We have Madison's notes, we have these letters. The first speech that is made during the convention is made by Virginia's Edmund Randolph, where he says that the chief danger that had brought them to the convention was the excess of democracy in the state governments. None of the state constitutions had provided sufficient checks on democratic power and democratic agency. And they created a political system that although it's changed in many significant ways, we now have the direct election of senators, more people can vote. Its basic character and its basic institutions, even to this day, I would argue, are preventing us from acting democratically and making policy democratically, including, to this day, still economic policy. Now, do I think that backcountry farmers in 1787 had like a very well-developed understanding of monetary policy? No, I don't think so. Things kind of worked out financially thanks to Alexander Hamilton and the first Washington administration. But to take that particular situation and to bake in a kind of anti-democratic character to the whole system, I think is something that should trouble us. And it's saddled us with the problems that I think we're still dealing with in our policymaking today. And it's time, I think, for us to really confront that squarely.
I think one conservative response to that would be, well, in our federal system, states have rights. And so, yes, if you look at it as a kind of a radical democratic view, well, then it seems crazy that there are 2 senators for California and 2 senators for Montana or Wyoming or something like that, or that the Electoral College seems crazy. But one conservative argument is this actually isn't a bug, it's a feature because it prevents majorities in a small number of populous states for imposing their will on the rest of the country. And I'm wondering what you think about that, what your response to that argument is.
Well, I mean, I think it's a common response. I mean, it really comes down to whether you think democracy is important or not. Like, it's either you believe that we are entitled to a basic level of equality when we make political decisions, or you believe in some other set of governing principles, which I think conservatives have the right to believe, but it's not democratic. The situation we have right now, instead of Los Angeles governing Montana or Wyoming, is a situation where Wyoming and Montana govern Los Angeles. Is that more tolerable? Is that more fair? Is that more just? I don't really think so. This is a question that they confront directly at the convention. There is a consensus that the Senate should be a body at some remove from democratic power. Yes. There's talk about the Senate being the body that represents property directly, yes. But even given that, there were founders who believed that equal representation actually went too far in an anti-democratic direction. And one of them was James Madison. James Madison hated the idea of equal representation in the states. He argues against it forcefully at the convention, so did Hamilton. He says directly, look, we're not really creating this government for state. We're creating this government for men, for people. States have their own utility, their own distinct societies, especially then, sure. But ultimately, they're creating a government that would act directly upon the American people, partially because the states had exercised, from their perspective, too much power. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, there was, in fact, talk about the national government having the power to veto state laws, that it was debated and they eventually did away with it in the way that Madison had thought about. So look, you can argue with me or you can argue with Madison if you don't like me from a leftist perspective making this argument. I think the arguments that are being made against equal representation at the convention and in the Fellows Papers, we see playing out to this day. They warned it would form a kind of minority rule. They warned it would create these kind of perverse outcomes. And we're actually, I think, seeing that play out in our politics. So it really comes down to whether you believe in political equality or not. And if you don't, you come away with a different conclusion about our system. If you do, I think that the system we have is intolerable.
Let's get more specific. Let's talk about the Senate filibuster. I mean, it's very clearly anti-democratic when you can have, a minority of senators stop basically anything, except for some weird reconciliation rules, but mostly anything. But right now, certainly, a lot of us on the left are damn happy that there's a Senate filibuster because it's keeping us from all kinds of stuff that we would completely loathe. And so I'm wondering if you feel like there's maybe some benefit to having that check on a small minority or on a small majority, imposing its will on everyone.
Yeah, I mean, one of the general principles that I try to defend in the book overall is that we can't be fair weather friends of democracy. So I didn't know how this election was going to play out when I started this book, started in 2021. But, to see, because Donald Trump won the popular vote in this particular election, many people coming to say, well, maybe democracy is not all that. Maybe we shouldn't trust people. Maybe we shouldn't. I don't think that's a tenable position for somebody who's really, really committed to this system. You have to absorb the reality that sometimes you're going to lose, and that shouldn't reduce our faith in the system. And shouldn't undermine our capacity to accept those losses and to take that as part of the price we pay or the burden we take up when we have a democratic system. I think the same applies to the filibuster. Are there things that they could pass with the filibuster if it went away tomorrow that I would dislike a lot as a leftist that I think would be damaging to the country? Of course there are. But again, it's either you believe in political equality, or you believe that this is a good and just system, you believe this is the right kind of way to govern ourselves, or you don't. I don't think you can kind of split hairs about this. Now, I do think that we need checks and balances. I do think that there should be institutions that protect our individual rights, our individual freedoms. I do believe in some form of judicial review. And that constraints certain outcomes that you would have in democracy, sure. But the basic legislative capacities working in a majoritarian way is kind of ground zero of democracy. And I don't think the filibuster is tenable on those grounds. Does that mean that I accept the Republicans can pass something that I don't like? Yes, but that's what politics is. That happens, and you go to the American people and you say, this was wrong, this is bad, let's do something else next time. Here's what's happened as a consequence. And you have that kind of contestation. I think this is one of the examples in which we have a kind of consensus-based politics that leads to anti-democratic outcomes, that leads to the kind of perversions in policymaking that I think we might be better off departing from for more majoritarian politics. That means, sometimes you're going to lose an election, sometimes you're going to lose a legislative battle, and that's just part of the system.
When you deal with the judiciary, you write at one point, our federal judiciary, tasked with upholding our anti-democratic constitution, is among the most politicized in the developed world. How did this happen in your view, and why do you see it as a significant problem?
Well, I think one of the reasons it's happened is that each judicial appointment is incredibly high stakes. We have lifetime appointments, right? So if you want to lock in your perspective on a particular set of policies in the judiciary, you have an extreme incentive to do so, given that person is going to be there potentially until they die, many, many decades. And so that alone raises the stakes and raises the heat around judicial appointments significantly. I think one of the few, if not the only, developed country in the world with lifetime appointments for the judiciary. In other countries, it's much closer to a kind of civil service function. And I think that they have a healthier judicial set of institutions for that reason. So people propose all kinds of reforms in the long term for this, not only getting rid of lifetime appointments, imposing term limits, but also that maybe we cycle judges up from the lower courts instead of having these kind of pitched battles for who is going to end up on the judiciary. To make it more of a kind of mechanical thing, these are people who are supposed to be interpreting the Constitution, from a legal perspective anyway. Take the politics out of it as much as we can. I think that's probably what we end up verging towards in the decades ahead. But this is one of the sections of the book where I had the most difficulty making very, very strong recommendations. I think it's complicated, right? So, again, I believe in judicial review. There are other people on the left who I respect a lot who think that there's something about the judiciary's role, even in judicial review, that we should find troubling from a democratic perspective. How do we work that out? What does the ideal system look like, given that basic tension? That's, I think, a matter for debate moving forward. But what I think is beyond debate is having a system in which, somebody has a fall and you're watching CNN to figure out whether, as a consequence of that individual, having a health situation, you're going to have a completely different abortion rights landscape or a different healthcare landscape. It's ridiculous. It's crazy. And I hope that we come to a point of consensus on that at least.
And you talk about a number of specific reforms, and there are some that I would say fall in the category of, unless we have almost a literal revolution, aren't going to happen. Like, while I'd be all for, I think, proportional representation, it's a unicameral legislature. I think those are cool ideas, but I recognize the plausibility is super low on it. But there are really, I think people don't realize there actually are a number of reforms that aren't that implausible. Like, for instance, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And maybe some listeners aren't familiar with that, but you talk about that, and I've heard you talk about it as well in other interviews. Can you talk a little about what that is and what it would do?
Yeah, so I think it's really kind of amazing that more people don't know about this, given that of all the reforms that I think I lay out in this book, getting rid of the Electoral College is the one with like the most public support, the longest duration of public support. It's been in this public mind for a long time, and yet people don't know about this effort. So what the National Popular Vote and Interstate Compact is this. States basically can decide how their electoral votes are allocated. And so if a number of states totaling the 270 electoral votes you need to win say, we're actually going to give our electoral vote to the winner of the national popular vote, you've basically created this end run around the Electoral College where the person who wins the national popular vote will just get all of those electoral votes that you need to win anyway. And we've actually gotten to over 200 electoral votes assigned to this process. States have been doing this for years now, mostly liberal, mostly Democratic states, as you would expect. But, we're actually pretty tantalizingly close to getting that last 70 or so electoral votes committed to this process. There's some debate about whether, Congress would need to authorize this compact. Obviously, I think they should. The next time there's a majority in Congress willing to take a swing at this. Yeah, I think that this is a much more plausible route to ending the Electoral College than a constitutional amendment, which, there are people who say we may never amend the Constitution again, having how arduous it is.
Yeah.
So that's an effort that I think people should know more about. Certainly, I think that the Democratic Party especially should invest some resources in pushing forward. But there are reforms like that I think are actually well within the realm of possibility. Longer term things like fundamentally changing or eliminating the Senate, obviously, is that's a heavier lift. I talk about the reforms here as part of a long-term generational project of creating a more democratic society, like the civil rights movement, like the women's movement. I'm not somebody who supports having a constitutional convention next year, or probably even in the next 5 years, because I think that we need to have a real conversation about this. We need to really build more public support for the ideas, get people to understand these problems, have real debates about them, maybe test out certain reforms at the state and local level. But we're very, very far from being able to do, as you say, a lot of things I talk about. At the same time, a lot can happen over the course of a century. I think that go back to 1925 when we're living in a completely different country than we live in today. Certain things that we take for granted, whether it's equal rights for women and African Americans or whatever, completely inconceivable to somebody living 100 years ago. So do I think it's implausible that by 2100 we could have a different legislature, we have a different constitution, have a different system of government? I don't actually think that's totally out of the realms of possibility, especially given all the problems, cascading problems we now face with our institutions now. The fact that we're having this conversation, I think, should give us some encouragement that these things may be possible in the long run. We should start working towards them.
But there's one other change that I think a lot of people don't realize wouldn't take a constitutional amendment, and that is multi-member districts in the House. In fact, in the early days of the country, there actually were some multi-member districts in the House, and then Congress passed legislation saying you can't do that anymore. And so this is just a simple majority. I mean, this would be basic legislation, right? And so what do you think about that? Do you think it would be a move in the right direction?
Well, I think that'll be a great idea. I mean, it's interesting that over the course of the last year or so, there have been so many things that are just happening in the news that are directly related to the book in a kind of perverse way. So we're now, for instance, in this heated debate about gerrymandering. We're in this redistricting process. There's this tit for tat between Democrats and Republicans. There's a way we could break away from all of that. If we move to multi-member districts, it would reduce the incentives people have to gerrymander substantially. So to explain the basic idea here, as I think would be implemented by the Fair Representation Act, which has been put forward by Don Baer. And this is kind of how Fair Vote thinks about it as a group. Right now in American elections, congressional elections, you get to go to the polls and vote for one guy in your district. That guy doesn't even have to win majority. That guy could win 40-something% of the vote. Most people who go to the polls might not want that guy to be in office. As long as he gets more votes than the next guy, he wins. Crazy from a Democratic perspective, but it's something we all take for granted. In a system of multi-member districts, you don't just send one guy to office in your district. You have a district where you send several people, 5, 6, 7, however many it is, based on population. And so if your party wins, let's say 60% of the vote in that district, well, they get 60% of the seats in that district when they send that number of people to Congress. But also, the other parties get people sent to Congress on the basis of how many votes they get, whether it's 30% or 10% above a certain threshold, right? So each district basically in the country is then sending multiple people to Congress from both parties. This, again, eliminates really the incentive to gerrymander because it's very hard to draw districts that will completely eliminate another party's representation if you have a multi-member system. The other thing it does too is that it opens up the two-party system. You now have the potential for people who get, parties that get 10% of the vote or 15% of the vote, they might send people to Congress too. And so you right away have these small constituency and perhaps a growing constituency of people who don't belong to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party represented in Congress. I think that this is something we should really, really explore. I think it's also something that we face a lot of resistance to because it's such a threat to the two-party system as we know it today. But I think it's a fair way of running elections. And the other thing I say about it too, that I don't think people talk about enough, is it changes the way that we think about the country and its political geography. Right now, in so many places in our politics, you go to the polls, you come back, you look at, election coverage, and you see these big blocks on a map. Now, here's where the Democrats live. Here's where Republicans live, And you think about the entire country in that kind of big, blocky way, where the reality is, well, Democrats and Republicans, people who are not in either party, are distributed everywhere. There are more people who voted for Donald Trump in New York City in 2016 and in 2020 and in 2024 than there were in both of the Dakotas combined. Conversely, in the Dakotas, of course, there are thousands and thousands of people who voted for Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We don't have a politics where we tell ourselves that this is true. I think that feeds into, negative political division. I think it completely distorts our understanding of who we are as a country and feeds all kinds of neuroses. But if we had a system of multi-member districts, you would elect Democrats and Republicans and people who are not affiliated from all parts of the country. You'd have very, very left-wing rural people. You would have conservatives in cities, and these would, diversify the perspectives we get in Congress. I just think that there's so many benefits to it that are worth considering, and that I think would be healthy for us to try to draw from.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of talk about partisan polarization, and certainly that's a very real thing. But I think what's often underappreciated is there is one aspect in which Republicans and Democrats, at least elected officials, at least in Congress, are very much together, almost in lockstep, is this is a system that's worked for them. Right? Yes. This two-party monopoly or duopoly on power has been great for them. They understand the rules. They've won at this game. They're mostly ensconced in their gerrymandered districts and so forth. And so one of the frustrations to me is that unlike in the states, we don't have a national referendum process to go around Congress, because as we've seen in many of the states that have this, now the state legislatures are trying to change that and eliminate the rights of the people because they don't like their power being taken away from them. And it seems to me that kind of goes right to the heart of a lot of things you're talking about in the book.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I don't think that we have political leaders that have this kind of first principle commitment to democracy. I think the Democrats have a first principle commitment to the system as they've known it and protecting the integrity of the system. And look, I think that there are things that are worthwhile about protecting institutions and making sure that people don't come in and topple them and do illegal things and so on. But it's democracy that we're actually after, I should think, or at least I hope people come to believe after reading this book and after all we've talked about. I think you're right to say that we have a political system in which neither party really seems all that committed to that. And I think that's a source of a lot of the problems we face as a country. And I don't know that we solve them unless we fundamentally change their thinking. And if we don't change their thinking, we just change them. We replace these leaders with people who are willing to take democracy seriously and pursue it as a movement on the level of, again, the civil rights movement or the women's movement as things that, fundamentally change the character of this country for the better. I think democracy ought to be the next thing on the docket.
Yeah. But as you pointed out earlier, at least alluded to earlier in those 4 principles, that as long as we have major inequalities in wealth, we could maybe tinker as much as we want with sort of these mechanisms. But if these inequalities persist, and the fact of the matter is someone like an Elon Musk can speak much more loudly to far more people than you or I can. And so dealing with inequalities in wealth has to be a key component of sort of revitalizing a democracy or having a real democracy. What do you see as maybe the most important steps we could take toward that?
Well, so I think that reducing inequality is important for 2 reasons, democratically speaking. One, as we've talked about, it improves the health of the political system. You have less people with high concentrations of wealth. We have fewer people using that wealth to corrupt the political process or tilt it in their direction. You have fewer situations like the Elon Musk situation. And I think that's tremendously important. The other thing I'd say, too, is that the concentration of wealth in the economy is also its own democratic problem even apart from the ways in which wealth intersects with politics. Look, we spend about a third of our lives at work. The decisions that are made at work often affect us more directly, intimately, and immediately than decisions made in Washington, D.C. And yet we take for granted that we're not really entitled to any kind of democratic voice within the companies we work for or within the economy. Elizabeth Anderson, philosopher at the University of Michigan, writes, I think pretty compellingly, that is a kind of authoritarian situation in its own right. The lack of agency, lack of voice we have at work, especially now that unions have declined over the last several decades, is in and of its own right a democratic problem, and one that feuds the concentration of wealth at the top. If fewer people from below can make demands for that wealth or have a piece of it and have an agency about how it's distributed, it could cruise to people like Elon Musk. And that's a democratic challenge in its own right. So, you read political science books and, there'll be sections about getting rid of Citizens United, which we should do. There'll be sections about campaign finance reform and lobbying reform. I think all of that is tremendously important. But the reality is that apart from those kind of very direct things, the level of inequality in American society in general has to be addressed for our democratic health and for our democratic well-being. And so that means I think that taxing the rich is important. I think that regulating companies is important, antitrust is important, all those things are important. But I also think that the basic structure of firms is also important. And the amount of voice that we have, an agency we have as workers, is also very, very important. And so I'd like to see, as part of a democratic project, a revival of the labor movement in this country. In the 50s, we had about a third of the workers in this country belonging to unions. Now we're at 6% private sector union density. That to me is a democratic problem. Unions are a democratic institution. They're formed either by elections or by majority assent. They use that power to advocate for working people in Washington, D.C. or our state capitals. These are legislatures, policymaking bodies that do not otherwise have very many representatives of ordinary working people. Unions were part of filling that space. And I think, too, that unions were kind of training grounds for democracy in all kinds of important ways. When you come together with your fellow workers to solve a problem, to have debates and discussions and practice compromising and all these different things, those are skills that I think you take into political life as well. And so the collapse of unions, I think we could see, frankly, as a kind of democratic tragedy. We should be reviving them for that reason. It would help us address inequality as well. But I also talked about other kind of labor reforms that are worth considering on the same grounds. In Europe, they have a whole infrastructure of things that we haven't really considered in this country, from works councils and co-determination, all the way to a kind of sectoral bargaining system where you have traditional unions, yes, but you also make agreements for workers across an entire sector. There are democratic aspects to that and ways you can even make those kinds of those forms of bargaining even more democratic than they already are. So I guess the long-winded answer to your question is that the reforms I think that would help us deal with inequality are structural reforms to the economy as we know it today. Not just redistribution, not just kind of insulating the politics from wealth through campaign finance reform or lobbying reform, but really, really getting at the root of inequality, which I think is the narrow amount of power and agency that is constrained to people at the very, very top of corporations, held by people who actually work there.
So then, in your mind, something like the PRO Act, protecting the right to organize, that pro-union legislation, that would kind of be a start, but only really a start. We want to maybe moving to more of kind of a Western European structure with much more extensive worker rights and worker participation kind of thing.
That's the idea. And I think the PRO Act is important. I think we should absolutely pass the PRO Act. But I think that we're at a point where we have to really, really consider a kind of broad labor infrastructure. You can read people like Sharon Block at Harvard University has put together a kind of platform and agenda on this kind of stuff. And I think we should see empowering workers in this way, again, as a democratic project. It would give us agency and a voice in place in our lives where we don't really have any. And I think we're entitled to some. If we believe that democracy is about having some say in the conditions that shape our lives, I can't think of a thing that shapes them more directly than our own material conditions. And the absence of that democratic agency, it should be to an inequality that is, I think, corrupting our political system and, frankly, leading us down the path to authoritarianism. And so I would hope that people begin seeing these worlds as intertwined. You cannot cleave the political apart from the economic. They are connected intrinsically. And I think we're coming to a point in our politics that's becoming harder and harder for us to ignore.
Final question for you. I always try to end on as much of an up note as possible. And certainly we don't want to end on the road to authoritarianism. It wouldn't be, maybe for some people that's a great thing, but not for me, not for you. So when you look around today, what do you see out there that maybe gives you some grounds for optimism?
Man, that is the toughest question of all. I don't know it seems that much. Look, what I'll say is this. I don't look so much at things out there today to give me optimism. I think a lot about American history in this respect. Actually, there have been a lot of debates in the last decade or so about how to interpret American history, whether attention to all the things that have gone wrong in American history, all the evils that have been committed and so on, makes us more pessimistic about the country. For me, it's actually the opposite. Knowing how bleak and dark things have been in our past, and frankly, in our very recent past, actually allows me to look at something like Donald Trump being elected or authoritarianism and say, well, this is not really, compared to slavery, compared to, genocide, compared to all of these other things, our current situation is not only, less bad, but something we can work through. If we can work through all these other challenges, and if we can work through that kind of black void in our history, morally, and we're working our way towards a better country, I don't think that we have any less ability to do so today. I think we're closer to the kind of world that I want that we would have been 100 years ago, 150 years ago, even given all the bad things that are happening now. And so that's what gives me optimism, in the sense that, look, if you, wanted to be a fatalist in 1925, again, you would have had a lot of reasons to be on the question of racial equality or questions of, equal rights for all people, no matter what gender they are, what race they are. You would have had many, many reasons to doubt that the world that you wanted was plausible. People understood that and still worked for these things anyway. And so what excuse do we have right now to despair because Donald Trump won an election or because we're in this political situation we're in now? I think that, again, you accept in democracy that sometimes you're not going to get your way and you move forward. You try to create a better world. You try to do what you can to improve your situation and make better arguments to more people and hope that eventually brings us to a better place. And I think that's what we have to do now.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, we will close. Asita Nwevu, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,